Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Let's get into it.
This time, we're wading into the world of cybersecurity.
Always a hot topic.
You know it. We've got a ton of stuff to unpack. News articles, vulnerability reports, a few special reports on trends in the industry.
Lots to cover.
Yeah, our goal today is to make sure that everyone listening is up to date on the latest cyber threats.
So they can stay safe out there.
Exactly. So let's start with a story that's, well, a little unsettling.
One that might keep you up at night.
We could say that. So just before the invasion of Ukraine, CISA found out that Russian state-sponsored hackers were this close to getting into some critical U.S. infrastructure.
Now, that is scary.
Yeah, and you know what they were going after? They were targeting these companies called MSPs, managed service providers.
Oh, yeah, those guys manage IT systems for a lot of organizations, right?
Right, including ones that are super important, like power grids and communication networks.
If those hackers had gotten in through those MSPs...
they would have had a backdoor into all those systems. Imagine the chaos.
That's a chilling thought.
I know, and the thing is, this wasn't just like a one-time attempt.
Yeah.
The CISA official who talked about it said that these attacks kept going on until like 2 days before the invasion.
Interesting timing.
Right.
Makes you think. Definitely makes you wonder if there's a connection between cyber attacks and what's happening in the real world.
Yeah, it really underscores how sophisticated these nation-state-sponsored attacks are becoming.
Absolutely. And it's not just Russia we need to be thinking about.
You're right. The official also mentioned China and how their cyber capabilities are getting stronger.
Right. They're really embedding themselves within U.S. infrastructure, it seems.
Yep. So it's a pretty complex situation, geopolitically speaking. Okay, so we've got nation-states on our radar.
But what about the everyday threats?
Right, the stuff we all face.
The data leaks, the exposed credentials.
Like that alleged Grayscale Investments leak.
Almost 700,000 user records potentially compromised. Wow.
That's a lot of people.
Makes you wonder what kind of information was in there.
Names, email addresses, job titles, phone numbers.
Oof, not good.
Definitely not. And speaking of exposed credentials, it's not just those big platforms.
You mean like Grayscale?
Yeah, researchers recently found a bunch of popular mobile apps that had their cloud credentials, like their login info, basically just hard-coded into the app.
Really? Hard-coded?
Yep, right there in the code for anyone to see. And we're not talking about some obscure apps either. These were apps with millions of downloads.
Like what kind of apps?
Oh, photo editing apps, food delivery, even ride-sharing apps.
Wow, so if someone got a hold of those credentials, they could cause some serious damage.
Oh, yeah. Think about all the data these apps have access to.
Financial info, location data, contacts.
It's a goldmine for hackers.
They can steal your money, track your movements, even impersonate you online.
Okay, now I'm getting a little paranoid.
Well, there are things developers can do to prevent this, like using environment variables instead of hard-coding these credentials and implementing, proper secrets management.
But what about us regular folks? What can we do besides, living off the grid?
Well, you can be more selective about the apps you download.
Makes sense.
Check their privacy policies, see if there are any known security concerns, and of course, use strong, unique passwords for every single account.
Good advice. All right, let's move on to our vulnerability spotlight.
The fun part.
Right. We've got a list of active exploits and critical flaws that need immediate attention.
Things people need to know about right now.
Exactly. So let's start with a big one, a zero-day vulnerability in Fortinet's FORTA Manager software.
Oh, yeah, I read about that one. It allows for remote code execution, right?
Right. An attacker can basically take over a whole system without even being there physically. And get this, it's been actively exploited for over a week now.
Oh, wow. So hackers are already using it.
Yep. And to make matters worse, Fortinet hasn't been very transparent about it. They haven't released a public advisory about it.
So users might not even know they're at risk.
Exactly. And that's a big problem because transparency is crucial in these situations.
It allows users to take steps to protect themselves, like updating their software or changing their configurations.
Right. It's like, imagine if your car had a serious problem with the brakes, but the manufacturer didn't tell you about it.
You'd be driving around completely oblivious to the danger.
That's a good analogy.
So basically, anyone using Fortinet products needs to be extra careful right now.
Until they get their act together. Oh, and speaking of vulnerabilities, we should mention those high-severity flaws they found in Bitdefender products.
Right. Those could allow for man-in-the-middle attacks.
Which basically means someone could snoop on your communication and steal your data?
They could also mess with certificate validation.
So it'd be easier for attackers to pretend to be legitimate websites.
Exactly.
So if you're using Bitdefender, update your software ASAP.
Like right now?
Yes. And while you're at it, check your Microsoft SharePoint server too.
What's wrong with that?
There's an actively exploited RCE flaw that CISA is warning everyone about.
Oh, wow. Serious enough for CISA to get involved.
They've even given federal agencies a deadline to patch it.
That's how you know it's bad.
Right, so patching is a must for this one. Okay, last but not least, we have a vulnerability with a pretty interesting name. Shady Shader.
Shady Shader. What does that one do?
Apparently, it can crash Apple devices, iPhones, Macs, even Teslas.
Tesla's. Hold on. My iPhone can affect my car.
That's what the researchers found.
How does that even work?
It exploits how devices process graphics.
So basically a visual glitch can cause a whole system to freeze up.
Pretty much. The good news is Apple has already patched it, so as long as your devices are up to date, you should be good.
Okay, good, because that's a little too close for comfort.
I know, right? So we've covered some pretty scary stuff.
Nation-state hackers, data leaks, vulnerabilities that can crash cars.
It's a lot, so is there any good news? Or are we all doomed?
Well, I wouldn't say we're doomed. There's definitely a growing awareness of cybersecurity these days.
That's a good thing.
Right, definitely. The more we talk about these threats, the more likely we are to do something about them.
Knowledge is power.
Exactly. And, CISA and other organizations are working hard to identify and address these vulnerabilities.
So someone's got our backs.
And let's not forget human ingenuity.
True, we're constantly coming up with new ways to fight back.
It's like an arms race between the good guys and the bad guys.
But hopefully the good guys win.
Fingers crossed. But we'll be back after a short break to talk about some broader industry trends.
Like what's happening with women in tech.
And the growing impact of AI.
Stay tuned.
It really is amazing how one little vulnerability in a phone could end up affecting a car.
It's wild. Like that butterfly effect?
One tiny thing can cause huge problems somewhere else.
Exactly. Okay, so speaking of things being connected, let's take a look at some broader industry trends.
Zoom out a little.
Yeah. Our special reports this week had some interesting stuff about the challenges women face in the IT world.
Oh, yeah. It's a tough field.
Did you know that most women in IT are working overtime like all the time?
Really? Just
Yeah.
to keep up.
Yeah, it's crazy. And then on top of that, a lot of them feel like men are getting promoted faster, even when they're doing the same work.
It's like they're hitting a wall.
Exactly. And it seems like a big part of the problem is there aren't enough women in leadership roles.
And not enough mentorship opportunities for women.
Right. So we need more diversity in tech in general.
It's not just about being fair. It's about having all those different perspectives to help solve these cybersecurity problems.
Makes sense. Okay, let's switch gears again and talk about supply chain attacks.
Those are scary.
You know what's really vulnerable to those kinds of attacks? The U.S. energy sector.
Really? Wow, that's kind of unsettling.
I know, right? Like, what makes them so vulnerable?
Well, get this. Almost half of the data breaches in the energy sector last year were because of problems with their vendors.
They're vendors, like the companies they work with.
Yeah, the ones they rely on for software, hardware, all that stuff. 45% of breaches were linked back to those third-party vendors.
That's a lot. And it's not just one-time things either.
Nope, it gets worse. 90% of the energy companies that had a breach because of a vendor
They got hit again.
by the same vendor.
You would think they'd learn their lesson.
I know, right? And it's usually the same vulnerabilities getting exploited over and over, like that MoviUp software flaw last year.
So why do they keep using those vendors if they're so risky?
Well, sometimes it's hard to find another company that does what they need.
So they're stuck.
Kinda, and sometimes it comes down to money. It costs a lot to implement really strong security measures. So some companies trying to save money, but it ends up backfiring.
Penny wise and pound foolish.
Exactly. So what can they do? They can't just stop working with vendors altogether.
Right. So how do they protect themselves?
Well, they need to be way more careful about who they choose.
Do their homework?
Exactly. And they need to constantly monitor those vendor systems, make sure everything's secure.
So it's a lot of work, but it's worth it.
Absolutely. Okay, now let's talk about AI. This is where things get really interesting.
AI is changing everything.
That's for sure. Gartner predicts that AI is going to flatten organizational structures. Meaning, a lot of middle management jobs might disappear.
Oh no. So robots are taking over middle management now.
Well, AI systems will be making more of the decisions that humans make now.
That's kind of scary.
And that's not all. Gartner also says that we're going to start seeing AI clauses in employee contracts.
AI clauses. Like what?
Things about who owns the data, privacy concerns, even how salaries are calculated when AI is involved.
Wow, so AI is going to change how we work and how we get paid.
It's a whole new world.
Yeah.
But there's also the security side of things to think about,
Right, like AI getting hacked.
or AI being used to hack us.
Hmm?
Gartner thinks that by 2028, a quarter of all data breaches will be caused by AI being used for bad stuff.
Wait, AI can be used for hacking?
Oh, yeah. It can create super convincing phishing attacks, automate hacking attempts, even create new kinds of malware that are really hard to detect.
Okay, so AI can be hacked. It can hack us, Andy. It might take our jobs.
It's a lot to take in.
I know. It feels like we're living in a science fiction movie. So what can we do to get ready for this AI future?
Well, first we need to understand it.
Like learn how it works.
Exactly. And not just the technical stuff, but the limitations and what it can do both good and bad.
So we don't freak out over every headline.
Right. And organizations need to start thinking about how to protect themselves from AI-driven attacks.
Like securing their AI systems and training employees on how to spot AI-related risks.
Exactly. And maybe most importantly, we need to talk about the ethics of AI
Make sure it's being used for good.
and that it's fair. How do we prevent bias? How do we protect privacy? These are questions we can't ignore.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about nation-state hackers, data leaks, AI taking over the world.
Is there anything positive to take away from all of this?
Right. It's a bit overwhelming.
Well, the fact that we're talking about it is a good thing.
Awareness is key.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the good guys are fighting back. CISA and other organizations are on top of it.
That's reassuring.
And don't forget about human ingenuity. We're always coming up with new ways to defend ourselves.
So it's an arms race.
It is, but I think we can stay ahead of the curve. We can use AI for good and minimize the risks.
Okay, that makes me feel a little better. But speaking of risks, let's get back to those vulnerabilities.
The never-ending list.
Remember that Xerox printer flaw?
The one that turns your printer into a spy.
Yeah, well, guess what? It's not just Xerox. There's a new vulnerability in HP printers now.
HP printers.
Oh.
And it affects a ton of models, both home and business ones. So chances are someone listening right now has a vulnerable printer.
That's a scary thought.
So what exactly can hackers do with this vulnerability?
Well, it's not just about printing out extra copies.
Okay, good.
This one lets attackers bypass authentication and get into the printer's settings.
Oh no, that's bad. They can change configurations, access sensitive data stored on the printer, even use it to launch more attacks on the network.
So our printers could be a gateway for hackers.
In a way, yeah. We often forget that they're connected to our networks and can be just as vulnerable as any other device.
So what do we do? Do we need to lock up our printers now?
Well, the good news is HP has released an update.
So update our printers.
Yes. Just like you would update your computer or phone, check the printer settings. There's usually an option to update the firmware.
Firmware? I've never even thought about that before.
It's important. And just like with any other device, be aware of the risks and take steps to protect yourself. Stay informed and be proactive.
But it feels like there's a new vulnerability every day. How can we keep up?
I know it can be overwhelming, but the more you know about these threats, the better prepared you'll be.
So don't just ignore it and hope for the best.
Definitely not. Stay updated, learn about different types of attacks like phishing emails, malicious websites, all that stuff. Knowing how they work can help you avoid falling victim.
So education is key.
Always. Cybersecurity isn't just about technology, it's about human behavior. Be mindful of what you do online, follow basic security practices, and you'll be much safer.
Good advice. Well, we've covered a lot today.
Nation-state hackers, data leaks, the rise of AI.
Even the dangers of printers.
It's a wild world out there.
But the main takeaway is that even though the threats are real, we're not helpless.
Exactly. We can protect ourselves.
By being informed, being proactive, and taking steps to secure our data.
And remember, cybersecurity isn't just for the IT experts.
It's everyone's responsibility.
We all need to be aware and involved.
Well said. Okay, before we wrap things up completely, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on. We've talked about, software, hardware, even like whole systems being vulnerable.
Right.
But what about us? The human element.
Oh, absolutely.
We all fall for those phishing scams and social engineering tricks, right?
It's true. Technology can only do so much.
So how do we make that human element a little less weak?
Well, I think a big part of it is education.
Okay, so teaching people about those common scams.
Yeah, like phishing emails, fake websites, all that stuff. The more people know about it, the less likely they are to fall for it.
So it's about making people more aware of, like, the tactics that hackers use.
Exactly. And not just the tactics themselves, but also the psychology behind them, you know?
Psychology.
Yeah, like, why do these scams work? What makes people click on that link or give up their information?
That's a good point. So it's like a mix of technical knowledge and understanding how people think.
Exactly.
Oh,
And critical thinking, too.
oh yeah, questioning everything.
Right. Don't just blindly trust everything you see online. Be skeptical, verify information, think before you click.
Don't click that link that promises you a free cruise to the Bahamas.
Exactly. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Words to live by. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have, from nation-state hackers to data leaks, AI, even the dangers lurking in our printers.
It's a lot to take in. But I think the biggest takeaway is that we're not powerless, right?
Absolutely not. We can protect ourselves.
By staying informed, being proactive, and, taking those steps to secure our data.
And remembering that cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility.
Not just the IT guys.
Right. We all need to be aware and involved because at the end of the day, security is only as strong as its weakest link. And often, that weakest link is us.
So true. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Until next time, stay safe out there in the digital world, everyone.